Hello, beautiful people.
And welcome to Ask Zajef number 9. Hi. This is the first Ask Zajef since 3.0. The patch has been out for 5 days now, so as like a disclaimer for this one, whenever I talk about Dendro related stuff, just keep in mind that the patch hasn't been out for very long, and there's likely stuff I haven't figured out yet. Take things with a little bit more of a grain of salt today than usual because, well, yeah, obviously, everything is very new. But yeah, let's get right into it. So, the first question that was asked is, what's my favorite Burgeon Thoma team? And honestly, I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually like Burgeon Thoma teams very much. First off, I don't have a Kitane Cross Spear because I have an R5 Crescent Pike, just don't ask why. I don't really want to craft one either, but when you don't have Kitane, Thoma doesn't really have a good weapon. So when I've been playing the Thoma teams, I haven't been performing as well as I should. But even with that aside, I'm kind of disappointed with Thoma's performance in a lot of Burgeon teams. It feels as though you just don't get enough. That's the issue that I've had with most Burgeon teams I've tried, is it doesn't feel like you get enough for what you put into it. It doesn't feel like the 6 Burgeons you're gonna trigger with Cole are worth building your whole team around it. You can get 12 if it's an AoE, assuming they don't all hit at the same time. Yeah, I haven't really liked it very much. I don't think there's any Thoma teams that I've been very much enjoying or that I would particularly recommend. I think that there can be in the future once we get better Dendro applicators, but with what we have available to us right now, it doesn't feel like there's a point to playing Thoma over a lot of the other options that you could do. You just don't get enough seeds to justify putting Burgeon on your team, is basically what I'm getting at. The only way that you do get enough seeds is if you're running some Burgeon teams with an Electro unit, because the Electro unit kind of ends up doubling the amount of seeds you can generate, which is really good. And I think that Thoma official Dendro main character Kokomi is like viable, but I'm not a very big fan of it. I just think there's just significantly better teams generally. This is post-editing Zajef, and I'm basically just here to nuance some of the things I said about Thoma. I really haven't liked the versions with on-field Ayato or on-field Kokomi, but a quick swap version with Thoma, Singso official, and Dendro main character has actually felt pretty okay. I wouldn't say it's the most fun or most successful Burgeon team I've played, but it's definitely the most successful one with Thoma. Its biggest disadvantage, I guess, is that you don't have a real healer, and you're running a team without a real healer when your damage can actually self-damage, which can sometimes make it pretty hard to, well, not die. But if you can get past that, it's actually a pretty decent team overall. What is Kuki's place in the meta after Dendro? A bit less bad. Most of the Electro units we have end up experiencing issues if you try to play them in Hyperbloom teams, and if you try to have them be the trigger for the seeds. So the issues that each unit can experience is, well, you don't want to be on-fielding with a unit that you build full EM, so Kutsing goes out the window. Lisa doesn't really work as a solo Electro because she needs too much ER and you just won't get enough EM to justify running Hyperbloom. Razor can work in some situations. Beto doesn't actually hit the seeds with her burst. Her burst just ignores the seeds altogether, which can actually be an upside because you can guarantee that it's always the same unit if you play her with an Anemo or with another Electro. But it also means that you can't play her solo Electro in Hyperbloom teams. Fischl will sometimes target the seeds and sometimes just let them be and not do anything with them, which means that you'll often end up with a lot of unreacted seeds that will just rupture, and that's not ideal at all. I mean, Sarah doesn't really apply much Electro. Yeah, Miko can target the seeds, but when she targets the seeds, she's not targeting the enemy, so you actually lose damage from your E to get the Hyperbloom stuff. It can work, but it's just, that is an issue that you have to get around. And so that leaves you with 2 units that I haven't mentioned yet for the Electros, which are Kuki Shinobu and Raiden, who both actually can trigger the seeds very, very reliably with their E skill. So here I'm talking about full EM off-field Raiden, not burst Raiden. But yeah, so both Kuki Shinobu and Raiden can do that. The thing is, it's not something that many Hyperbloom teams want, because most of the good Hyperbloom teams will want to have Electro on the enemy so that your Anemo unit triggers Hyperbloom by swirling Electro, more than they would want to have an Electro unit that just triggers Hyperbloom. There are some teams with it, and I think by the time this video comes out, I'll have a video on my channel about Hyperbloom teams and Singto, which you can check out for the uses for a unit like Kuki and Raiden in the Hyperbloom teams, and that's definitely a big up for Kuki. Also, her burst applies 5 instances of Electro, which when you're playing her like with Overload or whatever is kind of shit, because you apply Electro too fast And so you won't be able to have all of them react because you're going to remove the Pyro Aura. But when you play her in Aggravate teams, Aggravate doesn't remove the Quicken. So you can keep aggravating with all 5 of your Electro applications on Kuki's burst, which means that she actually does an okay, reasonable-ish amount of damage in Aggravate teams. So basically, Kuki is actually a pretty viable unit in both Hyper Bloom and Aggravate teams, which is pretty good. I'd say she's nothing crazy in either, but she's actually, you know, functional and decent in both. Taser, Serious National, and Reverse Meld are all 4-star meta teams. Which 4-star Dendro teams do I see becoming meta and popular like those? I'm gonna cheat and include main character because they're not a 4-star technically, but also they are a 4-star. And just because they have a yellow card doesn't make them not a 4-star. They're a 4-star, shut up. So I will be using Dendro main character for this, but there's actually quite a few. I would say that a team that I'll probably end up playing a lot in the future will be this team. Obviously, it doesn't have a healer, which can be pretty difficult, but it's just a very, very strong team in AoE. You can also replace either Beidou or Fischl. You can replace either of them with Xingqiu to play a Hyperloom Sucrose team. Actually, Thundering Fury. So Razor, Bennett, Xingqiu, right? This is an actually pretty good 4-star only team. But obviously, doing this one leaves you with pretty bad options for the other side. However, you can very easily do this, and you still have a functional team. I think there's actually a lot of new 4-star only teams that are pretty solid, so I'm really happy about that. But very often, it'll still be difficult to build 2 teams with a healer that are actually good. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. Is the Dendro version of Taser strictly better than traditional Taser? No. It definitely is going to have its situations where it performs better, but you're inherently not playing Xingqiu. The main reason why Taser became such a popular team, even without a healer, is because you're just so tanky. Beidou offers a lot of damage resistance, and Xingqiu does too. Beidou's burst, in my case, is 37% at talent level 13. It's a little bit less if you're at lower talent level, but that's 37%. Xingqiu, 29, but he also gains another 20% of his Hydro damage, and if you build him with Hydro Goblet, which you basically always do, you're basically at a hard minimum of 66.6% Hydro damage because he gets 20% from this. So he gets, which means that the total amount of damage reduction is almost 80%, because the way that damage reduction stacks is additively. You just add them together. But that's why you might have seen a showcase of Xingqiu plus Beidou plus Jean not taking damage, because it adds up to over 100% damage reduction, and you just don't take damage. But yeah, so you gain 80% damage reduction, which means that effectively, right? Usually, if I'm on fielding with Sucrose, I can take up to 15,000 damage. But with this damage reduction, I can take up to 72k, which is just a lot more. And then on top of that, you also add that Beidou gives you a shield with C1, and Xingqiu gives you a little bit of healing with this. And so on every rotation, you're gaining a shield for 16% of Beidou's HP, which is 18k. But with your damage reduction, this about 3k health shield can actually tank about 14k instead. And then Xingqiu's healing, it's healing you for 6% of his max HP for each. He's at 17k-ish. And this is the amount that you're healing, but you're basically healing for an equivalent damage taken of about 20k. Effectively, right? When you go for Xingqiu plus Beidou, you end up with over 30k buffer of hits you can take during your rotation without actually losing HP, which is more than what a character usually has as their HP, which is why, even though it doesn't have a healer, it still sees a lot of play by players bad and good alike. But once you start removing Xingqiu from the equation, well, you don't have Xingqiu's heal anymore, and Beidou's shield isn't as valuable anymore. So now instead of it being 70k plus a 30k thing that you get every rotation, it's 24k with a 4k thing you get every rotation. It is significantly less forgiving to not run Xingqiu because of the way that the damage reduction stacks. Similarly, running only Xingqiu is also still pretty rough. 26 with a 7k buffer, right? Versus the 24 with a 4.5k buffer. Running either of them as your only form of defensive option is relatively difficult and is going to necessitate actually learning the enemy's attack patterns. But running both of them at once means that you're basically invincible. But yeah, to get back to the like Dendro Taser teams or Sucrose Aggravate teams, right? They're significantly harder to pilot because you don't have Xingqiu. And also, they have less of their damage coming from single target sources, which means that it is also going to perform a bit worse in single target situations. You also don't have as much stagger because Electrocharge staggers enemies, and it helps a lot with preventing them from doing annoying attack patterns. Having played it on the current 12-3-2 a bunch of times for both traditional Taser and Sucrose Aggravate teams, you actually notice that the Cryo Gunners shield up a lot more quicker with the Sucrose Aggravate teams because you're not staggering them as much and preventing them from doing their attacks. So, no, it's not just better, but I would argue that, yeah, it's probably generally going to be a slight increase in damage. I don't think I would recommend it over traditional Taser when it comes to just, like, having a comfy team that does everything. I think that I would stick to Taser for that. Obviously, though, if you don't have your Xingqiu available because you need him in another team, because a lot of teams like Xingqiu, then it's something you can do, though. What do you think of Gilded Dreams on Miko? It's pretty good. The way that the Gilded Dreams set works is when you trigger a reaction, you get a buff based on whatever elemental type. But you cannot trigger the effect again for 8 seconds. So, 516, right? I get the buff. I'm at 666. And then while I'm at 666, I shoot him, I get aggravates, right? And I get the damage bonus from this. But if I do the same thing, now wait a little bit, and then I do another one, right? I wait a few seconds, I look at my stats, and I'm back down at 516. Which means that the second time I shot him and I triggered Aggravate, I didn't actually refresh the duration. So what ends up happening is the first reaction you trigger every 8 seconds will not get the EM bonus. Right, if I trigger Aggravate on the first hit, it's 75, and then it's 79. Second hit is higher because I had more Elemental Mastery. But the thing with Miko is that her electro application is pretty slow. So what will end up happening is every 8 seconds, you will miss an Aggravate. It's not that you're gonna miss the Aggravate, you're still gonna get the Aggravate, but that Aggravate is not gonna have the 150 or 100, depending on whether or not you have another Electro, Elemental Mastery that you gain from this. And because she doesn't apply Electro that quickly, because in 8 seconds she applies Electro like 3 times, obviously it depends, with her burst is gonna be more, she ends up like losing the effect on a pretty significant portion of her damage. Now, does that mean that it's a bad set? No. Because since Miko converts Elemental Mastery to damage percent, even though you don't get full uptime on it, it's still a good set. But it is one thing to keep in mind if you're going to be playing Miko with that set, is that it's not as good as you might think it is because you can't refresh the duration. So every 8 seconds, you will have one Aggravate that doesn't get the bonus. TF versus Gilded Dreams on Cyno, that's a huge it depends. As of the time of this recording, Cyno has been leaked. We're still in the first week of the beta cycle, which means that he hasn't received any buffs or nerfs in the beta yet. He's not looking too great. And even if he does end up being released in this state, which I kind of doubt, I'm still gonna go for him because I think he's got really cool gameplay. But yeah, so just keep in mind when I talk about stuff like this, take it with a massive grain of salt, because A, it's leaked so it's subject to change, but B, I'm not a beta tester, so I'm relying on second, third, fourth hand information, and I don't really have good ways of verifying the accuracy of them. So the way that his kit works is kind of works like Razor, where his burst buffs his normal attacks, and then he can use his E, and it's slightly different in his burst than it is outside of his burst. But there are a few key differences. The first one being it replaces the attacks with Electro instead of just adding an Electro hit, unlike Razor. It also changes the cooldown. So outside of his burst, his cooldown is 7.5, I think, and inside of his burst, it's 3. And it generates energy, but not that much. Anyways, it has a 3-second cooldown, but he has an Ascension passive that every 4-ish seconds, his next E will deal more damage, but you don't have a very large window to do it, which means that if you just use your E and then you get the Ascension 1 thing, then by the time you get your next E, your Ascension 1 window will have passed and you'll have missed your Ascension 1. And the Ascension 1 is worth waiting for because it's a lot of damage. So usually what you're going to want to do is you're going to have to use his E every 4 seconds instead of every 3 seconds. With Thundering Fury, you can reduce his cooldown to 2 seconds instead of 3, which means that it might be able to line up with the Ascension 1 that's 4-ish seconds. Whether or not it's going to be able to line up consistently, whether or not it's going to rely on not getting hit, we don't know. We don't know any of that. We haven't seen much footage of it. We're basically just waiting. But I know that a lot of people want to start pre-farming in advance. So for those of you who do, both Thundering Fury and Gilded Dream set should be good. The Gilded Dream set is going to be a safe option because it is going to work. But if the TF set works, it's gonna be better. But if the TF set doesn't work, then it's not gonna be better. Personally, I've been farming Thundering Fury. I'm gonna keep farming Thundering Fury, and I'm gonna play him with Thundering Fury whether he works with it or not, because I love Thundering Fury. But I also unironically think that they're gonna try to make him work with it. So, as a general rule, I would farm Thundering Fury, but if you've already farmed a lot of Gilded Dreams, it's not the end of the world. He's still gonna be okay with it. Another thing that is important to know is that those are not the only two sets that will work with him. His signature weapon synergizes very well with the Gilded Dream set because it converts Elemental Mastery to attack, so the more Elemental Mastery you have, the more attack you gain out of the weapon. And because it's a passive that's unique to that weapon, then for that weapon specifically, Gilded Dreams is gonna be better than usual. But with that weapon aside, from what I've looked at, it looks like 4-piece Gilded Dreams, 4-piece Gladiators, 4-piece Thunder Soother are all around the same ballpark of how much damage they will deal. Honestly, you can't really go wrong with farming for his sets. Are there any good Burgeon teams that can use Pyro Swirls to proc Burgeon? No, because in order to get Pyro Swirls, you need to have a Pyro Aura on enemies. And if you have a Pyro Aura on enemies, that means you can't trigger Burgeon. The reason why it can work with Hyper Bloom is because when you have an Electro Aura on the enemy, that can coexist with Hydro, and then applying Dendro to that is still gonna trigger a seed. And while Dendro can coexist with Pyro when enemies are burning, if you apply Hydro to that, it doesn't bloom. Technically it can if you're applying 2 units of Hydro, but like, we don't have any units that are able to apply 2 units of Hydro more than like once or twice per rotation. Here's what I mean. Right, you trigger burning, and then you apply Hydro to it, and it vapes, but it doesn't trigger bloom. It just removes the burning. So you need to apply 2 instances of Hydro, which can be pretty difficult, especially if you only have 1 Hydro unit. And if you're running Anemo, Pyro, Dendro, Hydro, which is what you would need to trigger Burgeons with an Anemo unit, then you don't have room for another Hydro unit, right? That would make 5. If you apply 2 units of Hydro, you can actually get Bloom and Vape on the same hit. Right, I generated a seed and I got a vape, but there's no ways to reliably get that. Also, most Anemo units have infusions, so you can just infuse Pyro if you really want to. That being said though, there is 1 unit that can swirl Burgeon, and that's Jean, because she swirls your character and not the enemy, which means that if the problem is you can't have the enemy affected with Pyro because that fucks over how much blooms you're generating, then just have yourself be applied with Pyros and trigger them with Jean. Right, so you can do Sunfire Jean with Dendro. But the rotations are a little scuffed though, so it's still not a team that I think is very good, but it is functional.
有大家在身边，风，回应我吧。
And as you can see, right, we're getting our Burgeons. It is from the swirls and shit. But as you can see, right, because Cole's uptime is so dog shit, it just doesn't last for that long. You could potentially do it with Dendro MC, but then you'd run into a different issue where by the time you start applying Dendro, your stuff is almost gone. Because you have to make sure that you don't apply Pyro to Dendro main characters like Lamp for it to transfigure. This. I guess you could do this.
逃得掉吗？一决胜负，风，回应我吧。
Fuck off, man. But yeah, as you can see, right, you still run into the same issue where, like, because you have to layer your abilities in a specific order, then you end up with, like, really awkward uptime on your abilities, and you just don't get a lot of Sunfire procs. And at that point, like, just don't run Jean. But you can still trigger it with Anemo units with something like Kazuha. I've actually been kind of liking these teams, where you can use Kole with Kazuha and do 15-second rotations.
有大家在身边。
夜逃得掉吗？
试试这个，
I think it is something like this.
应该总攻击了。
往返自然，可叹落叶一剑之水。
来跳舞吧。
踏风，
收起来吧。有大家在身边，伤口。
夜灵逃得掉吗？
试试这个。
Obviously, not the best team. We definitely don't have the right stuff right now, right? I think that's quite clear. I think it's a pretty fun team to play though, because the rotations are like really tight. I think it's pretty fun. But yeah, it's not something I would recommend like generally, you know. I feel like I've kind of covered most of the stuff I wanted to cover. So I think we'll end Ask the Jeff here. Oh yeah, bye YouTube. See ya.